Hello, welcome. My name is Steven Sorensen. I'm the creator of Ctruth, and in this video I provide an audiobook version of Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and His Writings, Part 1, found in the beginning of Edwin Johnson's The Rise of English Culture, 1904. A link to the reading can be found in the description to this video. I want to thank the Ctruth patrons for their continued support in my endeavor to study and produce content. Thank you all. It means a lot to me and lets me know that you want to see more. Without further ado, Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and His Writings, Part 1. As this is the first volume of the author's works to be issued since his decease, it has been thought fitting that it should be prefaced by some account of his life and writings. Edwin Johnson was the second son of the Reverend Alfred Johnson, Congregational minister, and was born at Upton, near Andover, Hampshire, on the 9th of November, 1842. If he had any pride of birth, it was in the fact that his descent was from English yeoman stock. His childhood was spent in the country, and he never lost his love for its charms and associations. A studious and thoughtful boy, he read English history with delight, was proud of his country's greatness, and ambitiously hoped that someday he would be in a position to do something for it. Inheriting an old-fashioned courtesy of manner and a very chivalristic spirit, he had but a poor opinion of money and the position it is supposed to give. His home influences were, however, rather of a Puritan cast, and under the serene guidance of his parents he drifted, scarcely knowing how or why, towards the pulpit. In 1859, he entered New College, St. John's Wood, to train for the ministry, his tutors being the Reverend Dr. Haley, Dr. William Smith, editor of the Classical and Bible dictionaries, Dr. Lancaster, the chemist, the Reverend John Godwin, Dr. Samuel Newth, and Professor Nenner. He won 3 scholarships, took his MA degree in classics at the London University, and years afterwards, the aged doctor, then Sir William Smith, wrote of him as one of the most distinguished pupils he ever had. His contemporaries would agree that he easily distanced them in any mental contest which he undertook, while his courtesy, refinement, and quiet humor endeared him to them all as a friend and comrade. He did not possess the élan and force of expression which would have commanded popularity, but he had in debate, in preaching, and in conversation a rare and delicate skill in exhibiting some of the most charming sides of truth, and with quiet sarcasm he used to expose some of the popular shams and delusions of the religious world. Few men were so deeply loved and respected at college as Edwin Johnson, for while he was always an original and daring thinker, he never willingly wounded the susceptibilities of those who differed with him. He entered upon his first pastoral charge at Forest Hill near London in 1865. There he married and remained some years. His father-in-law's health breaking down, he went to tour with him on the continent, visiting France, Switzerland, North Italy, and Germany. On their return in 1870, Johnson accepted a call to Boston, Lincolnshire, where he settled for 9 years. This was a very active period. Carefully fulfilling his pastoral duties, he yet found time for writing and lecturing on important topics of the day, taking a special interest in the question of national education. It was in Boston that Johnson began to make his excursions and explorations into the beginnings of history. Among his unpublished manuscripts are An Ancient History and Anecdote and a monograph on St. Beowulfs. Of the same period are essays on Hebrew poetry and on the science of religion. While at Boston, he also edited Erasmus for the eminent bibliophile Robert Roberts, printer of an edition of the Utopia. The Apophthegms, with a memoir of Erasmus by Johnson, issued in 1877, was followed by the Colloquies in 1878. To the latter, Johnson added nearly 100 pages of judicious and accurate notes. No one, a critic wrote, could complain that they were in excess. The work could scarcely have been better done. A remark applicable to all his work, which is characterized by thoroughness and by conscientiousness. He was never influenced by any hasty desire of seeing his writing in print. Meanwhile, he continued his studies of classical, especially Greek literature, and read extensively in other branches. His own library, never a large one, was that of a poor scholar whose books are chosen for use well thumbed and annotated. Among his favorite authors were Horace, Seneca, Diogenes, Laertius, Erasmus, Lessing, Wordsworth, Scott, Jane Austen, and Browning. The Waverley novels, he once told me, he had read through at least a dozen times. The volumes of the double-column edition were always at hand, and in later years helped him through many a sleepless night. His own clear style owes not a little to his favorite, Scott. In 1879, he was appointed professor of classical literature by the council of his college and returned to London. This engagement enabled him to devote much more time to study and research. Henceforward, he became a constant worker at the British Museum and at Dr. Williams' Library in Gordon Square, both being within easy walk of his residence at Primrose Hill. Greek mythology and philosophy, as well as Greek ecclesiastical history, were subjects taken up to fortify his position at the college. These he studied deeply, and upon some of them wrote elaborately. His published literary work during this period included translations of Ewald from the Psalms, Meyer on the Romans, and a variety of miscellaneous articles and papers. He also gave considerable attention to the patristic literature and other branches of theological study. A glance at the list of his writings during these years gives a fair indication of the very wide range of his reading and of his great industry, while their perusal shows that he had acquired at the same time a facility and lucidity in expressing his ideas on the learned and abstruse subjects. His attainments in Latin and Greek were those of a master. A good French and German scholar, he also became familiar with Oriental literature. He had, moreover, a singular aptitude for teaching, and was able to invest the study of history with a living interest. Dr. Furnivall, who frequently met Johnson, thought him one of the most pregnant-minded and stimulating thinkers he had come across. He noticed his singularly attractive and genial manner and the breadth and depth of his culture. The college work was more than congenial, but the council, for pecuniary considerations, removing the arts department to University College, Gower Street, Johnson, after 8 years of professional work, was left free to devote his whole attention to literary pursuits. His works on Greek mythology and religion, and on the origin and process of religion, were soon completed, though not published. Another work was the translation of a collection of South German folk tales in the Land of Marvels, issued as a companion volume to the North German fairy and household tales of the Brothers Grimm. The preface to this work afforded its translator and editor an opportunity for writing an interesting article on folklore and of criticizing the so-called nature mythologists, whose opinions he considered were based on a radical mistake, presenting in their result an inversion of the truth. In patristic studies, he had taken a bolder course than is usually pursued by an orthodox professor. In England, Matthew Arnold had revealed to the layman the purely literary character of the Old and the New Testaments. Abroad, German and Dutch theologians had undermined belief in the personality of the supposed writers, while the author of Supernatural Religion had shown that there was no evidence for miracles. Johnson, after examining the literary character and authorship of these scriptures, proposed to himself a re-examination of the history of Christianity from its inception. The result of his earlier inquiries appeared in his Antiqua Mater, published anonymously towards the end of 1887, and in a Latin essay which he wrote for a Dutch theological society. The tracing down of the so-called early Christian records was intensely interesting. Coming suddenly after months of earnest research upon a clue, it was gradually revealed to him that the actual writers of the church and gospel histories were not ancient. Not one only, or a few only, of the supposed ancient writers seemed to write in a 16th century manner, as Canon Westcott had remarked of Jerome. Nearly all aspects of them belonged to that late period. In some respects, for one who had spent years in teaching so-called Orthodox Christianity, it was painful to have to record the result. But with that peculiar sense of triumph of which men are conscious when having cast away the leading strings of authority and having learned to depend solely upon their own intelligence, he did not dread any feelings of resentment which the results might arouse upon their publication, and so sat down to the onerous task of recording them. The Rise of Christendom appeared in October 1890. For a book of its high character, the press notices were, on the whole, hesitating. In some cases, discreetly silent. Few treated the work with the consideration it deserved, or challenged its statements or its conclusions, a disappointment to its author. It may be that Johnson assumed too much on the part of his readers and the critics, to many of whom the work was probably little more than a paradox. Gibbon and other historians are supposed to rest on the bedrock of authority. It was the supposed bedrock authorities behind Gibbon who were attacked in the rise of Christendom. Fortunately for its author, the book was understood by a few thoughtful men. The late Mr. Froude read it with the closest interest and attention and asked the author to call upon him. This Johnson did, the conversation on the occasion being followed by a correspondence on the questions raised in the book and on collateral subjects. In course of time, notices of the book and letters arrived from the Antipodes, where, by a few, as in America, the import of the work was perceived, and by one or two able critics, described as one of the most important books of the century, an appreciation contrasting greatly with the coldness or silence of the critics at home. Soon after the publication of The Rise of Christendom, Johnson, adopting the suggestion of a friend, wrote a work of fiction, the idea being that the results of his researches, if presented in romantic or allegorical form, might possibly be more intelligible to the large number of thoughtful persons unable, through lack of the very wide range of reading and knowledge assumed by the author on the part of his audience, to follow the arguments contained in The Rise of Christendom. This romance, The Quest of Mr. East, completed in 1889, was not published until 10 years later, when in 1900 it appeared over the pseudonym of John Soane. In it are embodied some of the author's observations on the phases of religious philosophy and its modern expounders. It was well written and has been very well received. The author meantime continued his writings, for The Rise of Christendom, comparatively small though its circulation had been, had created among the few a demand for further enlightenment. It was not possible for a subject so vast, a critical subject too, comprehending a wider field than that covered by Mosheim, Gibbon, and Milman, extending over the whole range of European and Semitic literature, to be disposed of in a single volume of 500 pages. A complementary work, the present volume on The Rise of English Culture, was completed towards the end of 1891. This work, which brings the results of the author's researches into medieval history nearer home, shows that the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon civilization is not only mythic, as other critics had already discovered, but also that the history of Bede and some of the chronicles could not possibly have been written before the time of Henry VII or Henry VIII. While writing English Culture, Johnson prepared several short papers on Saxon charters, British origins, English records, foundation legends of Oxford and Cambridge, biblical legends, biblical geography, Gothic and Saracen architecture, and made notes for a work on French culture, which is left unfinished. By way of relaxation, he also wrote about this time a series of papers on Robert Browning, touching on a few characteristic points in the personality and art of the poet. A primer or Elements of Historic Science, undertaken at the suggestion of Mr. Froude, was written in 1892, and a translation into English of the Prolegomena of Father Hardwin, copies of the Jesuits' work being scarce, and no full translation from the Latin existing. To various liberal and advanced thought publications, he contributed from time to time miscellaneous articles on the same subjects written in more popular vein. These included chapters on English history, articles on Gibbon and the origin of Christianity, on the history of Eusebius, and notes on Jewish literature and the Jews in Spain. Some of these papers have been reprinted in American periodicals. The Pauline Epistles, restudied and explained, an account of the origin of New Testament writings and of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, issued in 1893, had a fair circulation. The late Mr. Arbuthnot, Oriental scholar, met Johnson on several occasions to discuss the subject of chronology with him, and there is no doubt that Johnson would have produced a valuable work on calendars and chronological systems, but his health breaking down, he was obliged to lay aside the mass of notes and extracts which he had accumulated on the subject. This material was subsequently acquired by Mr. Arbuthnot. The Mysteries of Chronology, which appeared in 1900, was very largely based on information which Johnson supplied. The suggestion, however, for the formation of a new era, the Victorian, was Mr. Arbuthnot's own. Beyond an occasional letter to a private correspondent, Johnson wrote little more. His earlier and unpublished work, except that on Greek mythology and religion, was to some extent superseded by that containing the result of his latest discoveries and research. Of his work on the whole, he has recorded his own feeling and impressions towards the end of the Pauline Epistles. It was, he writes, a very distressing curiosity that goaded me to undertake these investigations. In one respect, the result had been a grievous disappointment, because instead of discovering a solid base of witnessed and accredited facts, I have found nothing but clear and irresistible evidence of the schemes and devices of a secret literary society, whose bold statements have again and again to be contradicted out of their own writings. The author writes strongly. He has been over the ground, I have not, and would try to find another explanation. Theologies and ecclesiastical systems formulated by societies, councils, synods have generally had their origin in individual speculation or belief. See below. On the other hand, the intense esprit de corps of a convent of monks went beyond anything that we can now realize, and led to grave sins against truth and honesty. The forgery of charters, bulls, and legal instruments of all kinds for the glorification of a monastery by its members was at least condoned only too frequently. It can hardly be doubted that the scriptorium of many a religious house must have been turned to very discreditable uses by unscrupulous and clever scribes with the connivance, if not with the actual knowledge of the convent, for such things were not done in a corner. If the forgery succeeded, and that they often did succeed, we know, the monastery got all the advantage of the rascality. No inquiry was made, and it was tacitly assumed that where so much was gained and the pride of our house was gratified, the end justified the means. Dr. Jessup, Coming of the Friars and Other Essays, etc., pages 160 and 161. The subject of literary forgery by monks has been strongly commented upon by Milman, Sir Harris Nicholas, M. Geary, Isaac Disraeli, and others. Also Arbuthnot, Mysteries of Chronology. These things were not done in a corner, Paul is made to say, but they were done in a corner. We have not followed cunningly devised fables, the brother apostle is made to say, and yet the whole system is one of cunningly devised fables. One trained like myself to believe in and defend these writings, and to look upon the Church as, ideally at the least, a glorious institution, free from spot, wrinkle, blemish, or any such thing, could not reflect upon these things without pain. By instinct and old affection, my place is among her servants or allies. But the duty of the literary critic is no less serious and stern than that of the judge upon the bench, and my conscience as a critic compels me to condemn an institution which is stained, immaculate, and deformed by complicity with so much of falsehood and fraud, and to make what effort I can towards a new reformation. In these gentler days, it surely is not too much to hope that the Church may resolve to turn down her falsified and iniquitous pages, and begin the chronicle of a new era, inscribed with the records of her endeavors in the cause of knowledge, of truth, of human love, records at the same time of the admiration and gratitude of the world. May these things be. That, in brief, is the story of Johnson's literary work. Of what he was in his own home, or of his generous help to poor students, I am not permitted to speak. He was modest to a degree, and rarely spoke or wrote of himself or of his books. The modern interviewer was a person to avoid. If, said he, it was one of his last utterances, if, in the future, there are any inquiries about me, say, I live in my books. His books are, however, with one exception, impersonal. Johnson the man was greater than Johnson the author. Some of his feelings and experiences may be found in The Quest of Mr. East. Some are given above. He was no dry as dust, no recluse, but eminently human, genial by temperament, a cheerful companion, and fond of society. Until his last illness, he was saved from being cast down by a large sense of humor which one of his friends remarked had a kind of Charles Lamb flavor without the mint sauce. Though feeling the cold criticism, like St. John and Mr. East, he was on the whole cheered with kind words of men to him unknown, who praised the candor, the humanity, the this and that good quality of pages into which the thought and struggles of years had gone. One who did not feel able, or profess to understand the tendency of his writings, says, words would fail to record all the spiritual sympathies which were a living force in his character to the last. Of his affectionate affinities, of his subtle suggestiveness in conversation, of his powers to make men look their own thoughts in the face, many of his old students and friends will now be thinking, To those who knew the peculiar flavor of his humor, The Quest of Mr. East was a book full of charm, in reality a long drawn-out parable, depicting many salient features of the modern religious world and describing the search of the soul for the true Christ. There was a great pathos about his life, and the pain and difficulty associated with his course brought out more clearly innate refinement, while even amid disabling suffering he exercised a strange attractiveness which led into friendship with him men of all ways of thinking. He will live enshrined not only in the tender love of those who so patiently ministered to his dying wants, but in the hearts of a large number who gained stimulus, not merely from what he said, but from what he was. Another friend, member of an association to which Johnson belonged, wrote, "Those who were present at our last annual dinner did not fail to recognize that the Valkyries had marked out for death him who was the most learned of the guests. During all the years the dinner had obtained, the author of Antiqua Mater had regularly a place at the table. His reputation for sound erudition, and the daring devotion to what appeared to him historic truth which had subjected him to professional and social martyrdom, rendered him a conspicuous and honored figure, year after year, in our festive conclave. But we gradually came to lose sight of the accomplished scholar and the genial man. The massive brow, furrowed with the plough of thought, lost its classic severity in the good man's genial and benevolent smile, and we, his companions, lost sight of the most learned and the most lovable of men. Our late friend was too ingenious and unselfish for this callous and selfish world. He gave it the ripe fruitage of his intellectual and moral manhood. The world visited him in return," continues the same writer, "with the loss of his professorship and the rusting mildew of an unmerited neglect. He complained not, no choleric word did he utter by voice or pen, but the wrong weighed heavily upon his refined and susceptible nature. Old age supervened prematurely, and he who should have had the energy for valuable years of hard work still in him has been blotted out of the present, and is already an item of the past." Closer friends, however, knew the man better. Though he had put his hand and touched the sacred ark, and calamity had seemed to come upon him in the shape of an insidious and incurable disease, he knew that he had contributed towards the solution of the problem of the religious history of our Western world, the solution of which will establish spiritual unity. He was much encouraged by kind and sympathetic, thoughtful letters, and while able to continue his writing, had put his soul into it, striving for the nearer vision of the true, the beautiful, the good. He passed from death and life to rest on the 3rd of October, 1901, at the comparatively early age of 59, but his work was well done. His last message for me, one of his latest friends, who least expected a message, was to the effect that I would see this book through the press. With the generous help of a few friends in sympathy with the author's life work, that request is now realized. The text is printed verbatim from the author's manuscript. If it could have received his finishing touches, doubtless it would have been even more worthy of the reader's perusal than it is. In an appendix will be found a list of Johnson's principal writings, published and unpublished, including separate volumes, essays, lectures, addresses, and other papers, representing a great range of critical reading and of original research in European and Oriental literature. That concludes Edward Petherick's Edwin Johnson and His Writings, Part 1. Thank you for watching. Like the video, subscribe, comment, and never stop seeking the truth about chronology.